October 27th, 1646. The river breathed heavy and black under the arches, pressing its cold mouth against the stone, as if to whisper a warning too late to matter. Rome had been all day under a constant bruise of cloud. By evening a mist rose from the Tiber and braided itself through the lanes like pale rope. On Ponte Sisto, the lamps had been coaxed to life and then strangled by damp, their flames shrinking to small, stubborn buttons of orange. People crossed with baskets, bundles, and the wet silence of worry. Floodwater slugged through archways and licked at stairwells. It was the kind of night the city remembers, because the river insists. In the fog stood a little girl in a white dress, the hem stained to ash where the water had kissed it. She had slipped away from a doorway where neighbors shouted names and made promises nobody could keep. Her mother had not returned from the river quarter, gone to fetch a cousin or a cure, or merely the last dry loaf before the water climbed higher. The girl had waited until waiting felt like treachery. Then she had walked to the bridge because bridges claim to connect. She did not speak. She did not ask for help. She did what children do when taught to be useful. She looked and she listened. A cooper, drunk on fatigue and a little on wine, paused in the shelter of an arch and watched her. He would later not be able to say why he could see her so clearly when the fog erased details arm's length away. A seamstress clutched a parcel like a rescued child and whispered a prayer over the girl's small back. A priest took note of the pallor and decided he would ask after her once he finished carrying a bundle of ledgers to higher ground. The river made its own decisions, independent of theirs. The girl placed her palm on the parapet. The stone leached the warmth from her skin and returned a steady vibration. An undernote, like the throat of a drum. It told her what the city would never say aloud. The water had plans. She leaned over the edge, listening for anything like her mother's voice. All she heard was wood striking stone, barrels shouldering past, the distant groan of a collapsed balcony, and bees, it sounded like, a swarm in the arches. When she tilted her head, the hum thinned into a line of sound so delicate it could have been a thought. Crying. So far away it already felt like remembering. When she looked up, 4 lamplights in a row made a crown for the far side of the bridge. She closed her eyes and counted to 8, as her mother had taught her to count steps down to the cellar. Numbers as a spell against panic. She opened them and took a small step. And in that moment, the cooper in the arch saw something that would trouble his sleep. 5 darker crescents on the underside of the girl's sleeve, as if a hand he could not see had just let go. He shifted, wanting to call out, but the fog made a wall out of his tongue. The city above behaved like a city in trouble. Briskly, badly, with flashes of kindness and hoarding. The bridge kept its idea of neutrality. People crossed it with their heads turned away from the water because the water was impolite to watch. The girl in white did not ask them to look at her. She had already begun to learn that to be seen is to be interrupted. She moved toward the steps that spiraled down to the river path. Wet moss slicked the stone. She went carefully, one hand on the wall, the other open as if expecting a smaller hand to find it. When it did, no one but she felt it. A cold, neat pressure, reassuring the way a rope is reassuring when the night is deep and you have agreed to follow. Some later swore there was a woman on the bottom stair, eyes level with the river line, speaking softly as if to a lamb. Others claimed no witness, only the stubborn fact of a white dress, and a child's willingness to believe that promises behave. It is remarkable, the stories agree, how undramatically a life can vanish when an element decides to keep it. The cooper said there was no splash. The seamstress said there must have been. The priest wrote nothing about the child in his ledger. The river carried something away and altered nothing about its face. By morning the flood had receded enough to inventory. 8 dead by conservative count, 2 missing. The smell of silt occupying kitchens like a new religion. In the week that followed, someone found a woman's body near the island. Right hand open, fingers curved as if they had been holding something small that had slipped through. No one went to claim her. Of the child there was no trace, nothing to bury and nothing to blame. Rome did what Rome does, built a story to state the part the city could not stand to admit. Children go missing not into cells or forests, but into the old mouth that never learns to close. Years turned, the bridge stood, fog returned in its season, coating lamplight and memory with equal thrift. People began to speak about a little girl in a white dress who walked the crown of Ponte Sisto when the mist rose, who never spoke or reached out or begged a passing soul for help. If you looked at her too long, they said, she went away as if embarrassed to be caught, and after she vanished the air held a thread of crying that felt older than your attention, a sound that seemed to change location the moment you tried to aim your ear. A few said that if you were foolish or faithful enough to follow the sound, a cold hand would take yours and lead you where you did not intend to go. They said this with a shrug or a shiver, depending on whether they could afford superstition. The legend gathered small proofs, the way river stones gather smoothness. A night watchman in 1731 found 5 crescents blooming pale on his palm, then fading, and never again crossed the bridge after midnight. A washerwoman named Elisabetta tied a white ribbon to the parapet and left a crust of bread there. In the morning, the bread was gone, and the ribbon wet to the knot. A doctor, accustomed to naming fear in Latin, filled his notebook with observations about cold draughts and auditory illusions, then closed it forever after something took his hand on the top stair and persuaded him 2 paces down, before releasing him with a courtesy that read like warning. On autumn nights, the little white dress became a rumour in lamplight, and the rumour kept the careful shape of a child. Voices argued gently over whether she searched, whether she waited, whether she knew she was a story. Rome had lived so long on the love of strangers that it learned to feed its own ghosts like pets, enough to keep them returning, not enough to make them familiar. 3 centuries do not make the Tiber gentler. That is a fiction tourists purchase along with gelato. The river keeps its personality. Old, patient, convinced of its rightness. The bridge keeps its promise. Here to there, in all weathers, with indifference. The city keeps rehearsing its parts. Lover, thief, home, stage. And now and then, the night keeps its appointment with something that refused to finish. The museum guide in the present tells his group, in a tone hovering between fun and caution, that the little girl appears most often when the fog rises after a warm day. He points to the steps and says not to go down even for a photograph. He gestures toward the arch nearest Trastevere and claims the crying echoes there with better acoustics, as if grief were a recital. They laugh. They hold their phones like charms. 1 or 2 hang back, thoughtful, because there's a flavour to certain stories, a mineral taste. You recognize only once and never manage to forget. A student walks the bridge with a tape recorder. Not to bait the other world, she says, but to take it seriously. She has learned that the world is most itself when you stop requiring it to be metaphor. The student hears nothing unusual with her ears, and everything unusual later through speakers. The thin, receding thread of a child's crying, threaded with a rasping undertone like rope drawn across stone. She returns night after night, sometimes rewarded with an experiment's inch of new data, sometimes with only the river's old sermon. Down. Come. A retiree walks at dawn before the tourists arrive, ostensibly for his heart. He has moved across the city 4 times in 5 decades and knows the timbre of every bell. He does not believe in ghosts or live streams or decorations of that kind. Yet twice in 1 month, he feels someone small take his hand when the fog is thick. And both times he finds himself stopped at the top of the stair that leads to the river. Each time the grip loosens politely when he says aloud, "No." He goes home chastened by the ease with which his body had agreed to be led, and he begins to carry a second glove in his pocket to warm the spot that remembers. A girl with a white backpack smiles when a stranger asks if she has seen the ghost. "She's not for seeing," she says. "She's for not seeing." The stranger laughs and asks what that means, and the girl shrugs and says, "You look and she's gone, but you listen and she's there." She practices this every time she crosses, eyes soft, attention unhooked from the obvious, and hears the crying once, twice, never again. Because the river's generosity is as experimental as it is cruel. The nights belong briefly to the sellers, souvenirs, scarves, roasted chestnuts, and to the boys who smoke because the bridge's history makes them feel large. An accordion leaks the same song like a faucet. A woman does a fair impression of a statue until someone pays her to move. The little white dress, when she comes, interrupts none of this. She does not object to commerce. She does not ask artists to be quieter. She walks, pauses, turns her head as if a voice whispers in her ear, and the story adds another reliable sentence. When you follow the unvoiced, it hears you and is embarrassed by your clumsiness. On a night of soft weather in late September, a couple argues in low voices near the center of the bridge. The argument is about ordinary things: money, mother-in-laws, the way one person listens and the other never seems to. The woman breaks off mid-sentence and grips the man's sleeve. He thinks she has found a new complaint, but she is staring at a small figure at the parapet, her eyes full of an awe she mistakes for fear. "Don't," the man says, without knowing what he forbids. The woman looks too long. The dress folds back into fog like a gull's wing. When the sound comes, distant and persistent, the couple stops being a couple. He cannot hear it. She cannot stop hearing it. They part at the bridgehead as if something had given them directions to separate rooms. There is a second story that neighbors tell, ventilated with care like a sick room. It says, the little girl appears only to the ones who are already holding emptiness. The woman who lost her child at 12 weeks rests her palm on the parapet and feels, for one fraction of an hour, 5 small impressions answer. The boy whose father left when he was 8 goes down 2 steps as if responding to a call, and then staggers back, frightened by how much he wanted to obey. The old man who has outlived his friends comes each night without telling his daughter, and hears, once, the crying like a violin from another room. Andy smiles, not because grief is soothing, but because it makes a companionable sound when it bothers to be stranger than loneliness. If you gather these accounts and lay them out like bones, a pattern suggests itself and then refuses to hold. Children taken by water, parents searching, hands that fit in other hands even when the owners do not properly exist. The legend is most alive where it contradicts itself. Some insist the child drowned in winter because white belongs to frost. Others claim autumn because fog is the color of forgetting. A scholar notes that in the 1600s, floods commonly rose after long rains, and that 1646 records multiple days of swollen water. A priest who does not know he is echoing an earlier one writes nothing in his ledger because legends do not tithe. On certain anniversaries, unmarked except by weather, the bridge seems to tilt toward the river. Lamps make brief halos of their own smoke, and figures blur in passing like paint when you drag a finger through it. The little white dress walks and pauses and vanishes and walks again across the wide pupil of the bridge's crown. She never speaks because speaking makes her accountable to answers. She never asks for help because asking legitimizes refusal. She behaves as if she is still searching for a mother who is not in the world that answers to lamps. A man from out of town sees her and follows as far as the top step and stops because he feels a cold hand take his and then not pull. The absence of force terrifies him. He has always imagined evil as insistence and discovers he is vulnerable to invitation. He stands with his arm extended, held by a grip that is not weight but will, and tries to think of any instance in which the river has returned what it claimed. He cannot. He withdraws one careful finger at a time. The pressure releases. He falls back against the wall and laughs too loudly for the hour. Two pigeons startle. The fog continues to braid itself around the arch like a patient snake. Another night, a girl in a white dress that is not the dress. Her dress is cotton and stained because she has been painting a banner. Runs to the center of the bridge to photograph the lamps. She lifts the camera, finds the crown, and sees the smaller figure there in her viewfinder, where there was no one a second ago. The camera hunts for focus. If she looks up, the figure will go. She keeps her eye to the lens. She presses the shutter. The machine flashes and writes its version of truth onto a card. When she looks at the screen later, the image shows the parapet empty and the fog arranged into nothing. She deletes nothing. She keeps the photograph as a proof of the way certain presences prefer not to be treated like proof. The Tiber lowers. The Tiber rises. In summer, the water looks green and harmless in daylight, and children lean too far and are pulled back by hands that fear the future. In winter, the water turns black and speaks its old imperative to the foundation stones. Loosen, surrender, remember. The bridge persists in its old grammar, noun, verb, object, person, which is to deliver people from bank to bank. The little white dress belongs now to the bridge as much as to the river. She is the preposition, toward. The city's cheap guides write her into their jokes. The city's serious historians avoid her because she refuses corroboration. The city's living, which is to say its true choir, adopt her as a small precise caution. Some calls arrive without mouths. A new priest, young, exhausted, devout in a way that shows in the set of his shoulders, stops at the parapet and confesses to the air that he is failing at his task. He does not ask for a sign. That would be vulgar. The fog steps in around him like a congregation. He hears the crying not as grief, but as longing, which is close enough to the sound his private prayer makes that he answers with one word. Here. The cold that grips his hand is as shocking as sanctity. It pulls him 2 paces, no farther, and releases him gently back into himself. He thinks suddenly of parents and children, of the aching stairwells of the city, of a ledger where names do not always fit beside their endings. He goes back to his church and lights a candle he will later not be able to explain in the accounts. A tourist films himself with the river behind him and says, into the warm eye of the internet, that the ghost is fake, the crying a trick of acoustics, the hand a psychosomatic misfire staged by nerves hungry for myth. His comments explode with arguments from strangers who remember being 9 and following something their parents could not hear. The tourist sleeps badly and dreams of walking waist deep in water, while a small, polite servant of the river leads him to an address he cannot read. He wakes, buys a white ribbon he ties to the parapet with hands that pretend to be mocking, and walks away too quickly, as if pursued by courtesy. When the weather is right and the attention is wrong, the bridge lifts its old play again. The little girl appears, and the woman half a block away stops and shivers, and does not know why. A boy takes out his phone and finds only fog. A lonely heart pauses on the crown and listens, and discovers the city is an instrument you can play if you respect its older songs. Footsteps cross in both directions, toward home, toward trouble, like lines on a palm. 5 crescents of pressure bloom and fade on any hand that allows it. They are not a claim, they are a question. The earliest date in the legend names a flood and a child and a river that did what rivers do. Every repetition after that date asks, what do people do? They look, they listen, they follow, they refuse, they return. The story will end, people say, when someone learns the girl's name and gives her a stone to keep it. But the river prefers anonymity. It finds it practical. Names invite argument. Facts bend. Fog stays. On a night very like the first night, the fog rises with ceremonial patience, and the lamps perform their small duty with courage disproportionate to their size. The city hushes in the usual places and refuses quiet in others, as is its habit. The bridge breathes. The little white dress appears where she has always appeared, at the crown, turns slightly as if listening to someone at her side. Her hair is unremarkable. Her shoes are absent. Her right sleeve carries 5 pale crescents, just visible when the mist thins. She steps. She pauses. She looks toward the Trastevere bank as if the district could answer her across time. She does not speak. She does not ask for help. If you look at her too long, she will go. She is not a performance. She is a courtesy extended to those who understand the rude mathematics of grief. If you listen, the crying will arrive from the nearest impossible place, under the stones, through the hollow of the arch, from water that rehearses its one word forever. If you follow, a cold hand will take yours. It will not drag you. It will lead you with a gentleness that is indistinguishable from command. You will feel the tug that is not a tug, and understand, if only for the length of a breath, why the original child believed the river could be negotiated with like a mother. You will say no if you are lucky. You will say yes if you are tired. Either way, the hand will loosen with that precise old-world politeness that has always made Rome and its ghosts so persuasive. The Tiber goes on saying what it has said since before the city learned to listen. The bridge holds out its back like a servant. People cross, making bargains with time, with love, with elements. And somewhere between lamp and fog, a girl in white continues her unhurried errand, confirming what the legend has taught quietly for centuries, that the past is not behind you, that voices without mouths can still change your direction, and that the coldest hand you will ever hold may be the one that only means to guide. November 14th, 1887. Night moved over Rome like ink poured slowly into water, and the Colosseum took the darkness with the patience of something that had seen several kinds of night already. The last visitors drifted away in pairs, scarves pulled high, the glow of gaslight trembling along Via dei Fori Imperiali and across the broken ribs of arches. Vendors folded their tables. A carriage wheel clacked a farewell at the curb and vanished into the city's cavernous streets. The amphitheatre exhaled, a long, soft draught through its corridors, and the gods began their work of making a ruin sleep. They never said, "Lock up." The phrase felt ridiculous in a structure that had outlived emperors and earthquakes, popes and their decrees. They said, "Close the way you close a pair of eyes," gently, with the understanding that closing does not end seeing. Two men walked the lower ambulacrum, lanterns held high, the flame glassy with cold. A third took the upper tier, where wind prowled like a restless cat. Their names mattered to the ledger that would note their hours and their wages. The Colosseum did not require their names to know what they were. One was called Alessandro, the oldest, a veteran of city night shifts, with a habit of counting under his breath. Another was Niccolo, younger and trying to become a man by not fearing what veteran men feared. The third, a woman with a wool shawl and boots that did not slip, was called Teresa. She preferred ruins to palazzi. Ruins told the truth more efficiently. They checked the gates with the peasant respect city men develop for metal, latch, hinge, bar. Each fastened, each would hold a curious boy with a dare and a bottle, and none would keep out what the amphitheatre still invited because it did not understand the word after. Their lanterns stuttered in the draughts. Their breath made small storms that broke quickly against the stone. The first hour after closure belonged to routine, and routine was faith. Climb the steps, sweep the eyes, listen for human intrusion, ignore everything else. The first chain dragged at N840. Not a link pulled by hand, not a hook shifted along a floor. It sounded like a mechanism that had remembered it was a mechanism. It circled the arena's edge, a low iron growl, then retreated into the hypogeum where the trapdoors once opened the earth-like mouths. Niccolo flinched. Alessandro said, without looking at him, "Animals. The keepers who aren't alive anymore don't know they aren't needed." Teresa would later tell herself that was a joke and not a note of respect. They continued. The city sounded far away, as if Rome herself had learned to whisper. Only once did the outside invade. A burst of laughter across the street where a cafe was teaching a new song to a table of men with mustaches. The sound hit the Colosseum and died, as laughter dies in sanctuaries that contain other kinds of noise. At 9, the chanting began. It did not belong to a church, or a tavern, or a military parade. It had no divine ambition and no drunk sway. It came on like wind first, the sibilant hint of syllables gathering, and then settled into a steady, low insistence, the rhythm of men who need their mouths to set their limbs in motion. The language sat in the stone easily. It had been made for this geometry and this air. Teresa, who had an ear for dialect, recognized none of it. She stopped in a corridor and held her lantern away from her body, so her own light would not become a comforting lie. The chant passed before her like a small river in a ditch, with its own direction, its own decision. After it went, her teeth ached as if she had been clenching them. They announced themselves the way experienced people do in places that can lose you. "Lower ambulacrum clear," Alessandro called, voice kept low. "Upper tier moving," Teresa answered. Hypogeum mouth is clear, Niccolo said, pretending he had not nearly said clear for now. It was a season of archaeologists. The amphitheater's underbelly had been opened and labelled and measured, its trapdoors explained to girls who painted politely and boys who asked displeasing questions, its lift shafts described with the awe of mechanics who could not believe their grandfathers managed such machines with rope and insistence. By day, the Colosseum had become a classroom. By night, it became what classrooms remember when the lesson has ended. A place where attention had been gathered in a bowl and poured back into the walls. Teresa always felt that weight. Attention is a material. It sinks into stone and sweetens it, or it rots and feeds other things. At 9:30, Alessandro stood in the arch that opened to the arena and breathed the cold on his palate like a drink. The sand had been raked that afternoon by boys who could not keep from drawing their initials with their toes. Now the surface looked smooth enough to forgive. Alessandro lowered his lantern and frowned. A dampness was spreading from the center outward. A darkening round as smooth as if water had opened an eye in the sand and looked up. He took a step forward. Niccolo made a noise that intended to be scorn and failed. The older man crouched and held the lantern close. The damp was not a trick of shadow. It was a wetness that coaxed a smell into the air. The smell was iron and salt and animal, sudden as a memory your body keeps against your will. He touched the sand with 2 fingers and looked at them. Both old habits. They shone slick in the lantern light. He did not lift them to his nose the way a child might. He wiped his fingers clean on his trouser seam and pretended the gesture was an accident. Pipe, he said. Leak, he said, knowing there was no pipe that could leak there. Teresa approached and looked without crouching. Maybe, she said, and meant the opposite. They stepped back in the same motion and laughed at themselves softly for moving together like that. Niccolo, seeing their eyes and their laugh, wished to be older or younger, not stuck in the age where the world is both trick and trap. The chanting swelled then, from nowhere you could point to, and in it, a woman's voice braided briefly through the low male line, not pleading, not defiant, only present, like a fabric mender tugging a thread back into the cloth. It made the hair rise at the nape in the way the body obeys ancestors before ideas. Teresa saw the arena floor in 2 eras at once, the tidy museum of now, and the old world of opening doors and released bodies, an expectation like a second sun. She could not convince the second world away. She hardly tried. They continued their circuit to convince themselves that continuing was possible. In the southeast passage, a scream arrived with no throat. Muffled, yes, crushed under the sand of a century, but urgent in a way that punched straight through explanation. Help! Or its cousin in another language, or the sound that human mouths make when the body has already understood the answer and the mind begs to be told again. Niccolo ran 3 steps before the older 2 caught him with the imperious grip of people who are not keen to witness mistakes. If someone needs us, he said, we go. Teresa's "no one new ever needs us down there" was not a thing she would have liked to be right about. They stood then in the lamplight and did the thing people do against fear, spoke of measurable things. Teresa told them about a workman who had slipped the previous week and gashed his leg on a hidden nail in a newly cleared door. She described the sound the man made when pain outstripped pride. She told them how quickly the stone ate the sound and transformed it into something that no longer belonged to him. Alessandro nodded. Niccolo looked back down the passage and tried to unlearn curiosity. 9:50. The chant loosened and thinned as if the mouths that made it had entered the arena where noise turns into a crowd. A new sound added itself like a shadow added to another shadow. Chains being dragged in a circle, then up a narrow corridor, then dropping suddenly with a clang at the end. The guards felt it in their kneecaps. Mechanisms speak to bone. "You hear?" Alessandro asked, because the asking gives other people a rope to hold. "Of course I hear," Teresa said, because she refused to pretend that courage sounds like deafness. 10. A faint glow lit the far lip of the arena, like torchlight underwater. "Who left a lantern?" Niccolo asked, honest enough to welcome a human error by which to live the night. "No one," Teresa said. The glow moved as if carried by a hand, or by an idea that believed in hands. It advanced and withdrew with the rhythm of breath. The air cooled 2 degrees. They saw their breath climb and be eaten mid-air by the amphitheatre like bread thrown to fish. It happened then, the way rumours say it happens, and the rumour was never, in all its years, tired of being true. A figure stood in the arena, not grew from fog, not assembled from shadow. Stood. The lantern light, their lanterns, the city pole, all conspired to render its edges clear enough to be named, and yet not kind enough to be believed. He wore armour, the kind boys make from kettles and straps to mock stories, and not the sort you could buy at a market. Pieces fitted to pieces, leather speaking to metal, a helmet whose crest the darkness polished to a dull asking. He was not tall. He was the size of any man who has learned not to waste height. He held no sword. His hands hung as if he had just used them and would not again for a breath. He faced them without moving, and the part of their minds that catalogued details went about its profession with brutal calm. The broadness of the shoulders, the tilt of the stance that denotes either fatigue or readiness, the faint dent at the rim of the breastplate where a blow had surely landed. Then the face, the helmet turned to offer it, the apertures where eyes ought to have been. The darkness there was not darkness, it was absence, not cloth, not shadow, not theatrics, as if the sockets had been carved open and the world had failed to assign contents. You could look into them and believe yourself looked through. Niccolo muttered a prayer in the voice of his grandmother, words his mind had not rehearsed in a decade. Alessandro, who had seen river drownings and a rail accident, and once the aftermath of a duel fought too late at night to be romantic, felt his chest click forward as if he had been chosen to step into a play that had been waiting on his entrance. He lifted his lantern and thought of saying something like, "Ci sei," but the words snagged in his throat on an honesty. To ask a name is to pretend you can use it. He opened his mouth. The figure went out. Not vanished with flourish. The world removed him with efficiency, the way a clock removes a second you expected to hold. The sound that had been humming under the scene resolved into a low applause, then thinned into nothing, as if the crowd had learned it was impolite to clap in a museum. The guards stood in an ordinary amphitheatre again, with cool air and stone, with the city pulsing 100 paces away, with wages they would collect next week, with the stupid dignity of 3 people standing too close together with nothing to touch. They lowered their lanterns because they had to do something with their hands. The arena floor where the figure had stood darkened as if a cloud had passed. Only there were no clouds in the belly of the earth. Teresa hesitated, then moved forward as a surgeon might step toward a table, knowing what she is about to see will alter the day's logic. The sand under the place was wet, not damp from evening air, wet the way a bandage is wet. She did not touch it. She did not need to. The smell rose. Iron, warm, sweet in the appalling way that makes mouths water. She stepped backward. She kept stepping until the arch took her shoulder. The rest of the night retreated into work. They finished their circuit. They checked the locks again, because do something is a prayer. Teresa wrote the small log entry that would make the administration happy. 22 Mars. Inspected arena. No persons present. Minor moisture noted. Possible leak. She wrote moisture carefully, as if precision could protect her from a different precision. Alessandro kept the joke alive about the pipe no one could find. Niccolò wore a face that said he wanted the world to offer him the dignity of being terrified without being made to admit it. They lingered near the outer gate longer than their feet preferred. Cold gathered at their ankles the way cats do to people they like. The city cooled, patient as a mother. When they finally closed the last chain and slid the final bar, the Colosseum made a small noise that had nothing to do with metal. Teresa heard it in her ear and also in her teeth. A closing argument, she thought, and was not pleased by the law in it. They met at a cafe still open to the business of men who did not wish to go home yet. The table smelled of coffee and anise and the unwashed honesty of workers. They spoke not of what they had seen, but of what could be seen if anyone else had been there. Fog at ground level, said Alessandro. We are on a low point. The air condenses. An animal got in, said Niccolò. A cat bled a rat. Teresa offered him a rope of laughter to hold. There are always cats. The chanting? He asked, and let the rope go. Pilgrims on the road beyond the arch, she said, because lies said, for the sake of continuing, are useful. They went home separately. Alessandro's wife asked nothing. She had learned the economy of leaving certain doors in a man's mind slammed. Teresa lit a candle on her kitchen table and watched the wax behave according to heat, because she wanted one thing in the world to be obedient. Niccolò dreamed he had been given a helmet with no face, and when he put it on, the city grew quiet, in a way that felt like a hand over his mouth. The following nights behaved. They did not become easier. The mechanisms kept their schedule with the rudeness of old servants. The chanting came and went like weather. A scream carried from the far passage and turned mid-air into a mistake the walls corrected. Once, snow dusted the upper tiers and lasted 20 minutes. Teresa went out to the arena for the joy of seeing white on that old brown face. She paused at the center. Footprints had formed where no one had walked. The nail pattern of sandals pressed into the soft crust, moving in a curve around an invisible opponent. She set her boot into the print to see whether size explained the thing. Her foot fit badly. The print was narrower, the stride a hair shorter than her own. She took her boot back out as if the snow might hold her. Winter receded. Visitors returned like migrating, laughter. A professor from Turin, all angles and assurances, asked permission to test the amphitheater's acoustics at night. He promised to keep to the amphitheater's edge and not shout the ruin awake. They allowed him. He brought a cylinder phonograph and the neat pride of the scientific. He recorded the ambient night, and the next day played it back in a room so bright it might have sickened ghosts. On the wax the chains dragged. The chants laid their low line. The muffled scream arrived like a wave that lost interest at the shore. The professor frowned and declaimed. Resonance peculiar to large elliptical structures, with the relief of a man who has killed nothing and calls the unkilled explained. He stayed for a week. On the final night, he asked to stand alone at the mouth of the hypogum. Teresa obliged him because she understood the dignity of seeking. She waited beyond the arc of his little cone of light and listened as he hummed a single note and waited for it to return. The way men who love themselves listen. The note returned with a second voice braided under it. The professor turned his head sharply, and the wax cylinder stopped spinning, then began again on its own. He called into the dark, not, "Who's there?" but "Which door?" as if he had been told to be here and had arrived late. Afterward, he packed carefully and left Rome early. In his paper, he wrote about the property of echoes in amphitheatres and thanked the municipal guardians for their courteous assistance. He did not write the sentence that followed him to his train. I was counted. The rumour strengthened the way ivy does, quietly, with patience, refusing to be discouraged by architecture. A mason on a scaffolding swore he saw a man in armour climb the steps and turn his helmet toward him as if the mason's work needed judging. A boy slipped a hand through a grate and dragged it back with 5 crescent indentations across the palm, as if a hand had opposed his mischief with old-fashioned politeness. An officer from the Carabinieri came to investigate stories of vagrants in the corridors and left his card with a note on the back that read, "Please tell your night staff not to call me for this." He underlined this twice. He had nevertheless removed his hat when he crossed the arena. In the spring of 1888, a lightning storm struck the iron cross that stood in the centre, a devotional that was supposed to revise the amphitheatre's past by inserting salvation where spectacle had once ruled. The cross took the strike like a sentence. Fire fizzed down its length, and the sand around its base steamed. Alessandro and Teresa arrived 10 minutes later, wet to the skin and pleased by the living world's insistence. Steam clung to the patchwork of damp like breath on a glass. For a moment, the wet marked the outline of a man, then widened and erased its own anatomy. Teresa's shawl smelled of singed wool all night. In the morning, the Oitai's cross stood unburned. The city called this a miracle because miracles are polite. Catastrophes exhaust the police. Years turn small without the city noticing. The amphitheatre stones settle again a fraction, the way bodies do as they sleep. Gods change, men age, names slip off duty rosters, and land in drawers. But each night, whoever holds the lantern says the same sentence at some point, often softly and without pleasure. You are never alone in there. The chains keep their rounds, complaining. The chants pick up their syllables, content to be unread. The scream arrives and is absorbed. Once or twice each season, a figure stands in the arena and looks toward whoever has been given the task of looking back. Empty sockets. The mind now knows not to pretend. And always, always, the wetness at the ground. A damp that smells freshly convinced of blood. People say the gladiators never left. The guards learn not to argue with sentences that have outlived evidence. They do not explain loyalty to a building that took their measure calmly and decided to keep it. They do not speculate about a fight without end, or a crowd shaped like an appetite, or whether a death rehearsed forever makes a prayer or a punishment. They move along the corridors and keep their lamps from going out in drafts. They report leaks that have nothing to do with pipes. They mark on paper the inventory of locks and bars, and mark in their bodies a different ledger, the one that tallies breaths held, sounds endured, moments when something cold and gentle passed a hand to theirs, and did not pull, only waited, to see if the living would consent to step where the dead keep time. On a night like the first night, Years later, but not meaningfully later, Teresa walked alone to the mouth of the arena and paused because the air ahead had deepened, the way a room deepens when a new person enters it softly. She did not lift her lantern. She did not pretend she had not come to stand in the same air as something that had learned to use air with economy. The figure stood where it had stood before. It faced her, and in the sockets, there was the honesty of absence again. She waited, not for a sign, not for a voice, but for the small courtesy of acknowledgement. It came not from the figure, but from the ground, darkening without drama, damp spreading outward as if the earth were a cloth taking a spill. She did not step forward. She did not step back. She said the word that held her job and her century and the building in one syllable. Here. The chain dragged. The chant picked up. The figure translated itself into nothing in the way of all true apparitions. The wetness remained long enough to mark the hour. She turned and left the arena and did what the living do when invited to watch the unfinished. She finished her route, counted her locks, and left the Colosseum to its own attention. When Teresa stepped back into the open air, the moon had risen to a height that made the cross gleam faintly against the rim of cloud. The rain had stopped. The city's windows glittered below like hundreds of eyes pretending sleep. She paused beside the outer gate and looked back once, not at the arches or the seats, or the endless corridors that nested inside one another like ribs, but at the mouth of shadow that had been breathing since the day Titus had called it a gift. For a long moment, the silence inside felt expectant, almost polite, the hush of an audience that has not yet decided whether the performance is over. She closed the gate quietly, more gesture than function, and the sound of the chain through the iron rings came out oddly familiar, as if she were completing a conversation instead of ending a shift. The next morning, when sunlight hit the upper tiers, the sand in the arena was perfectly dry again. The patch she had seen had left no stain, no memory except in the way the air smelled faintly of rust and rain. Visitors entered in bright clusters, pointing, laughing, touching walls that did not mind. The amphitheatre endured them, patient, grand, secretly awake. Teresa's report lay on the administrator's desk, folded neatly, the ink already pale. It said only, 11 p.m., inspection complete, structure secure, all quiet. And that was true. By the small definitions the living are forced to use, she would go on working there for 20 years. She would train new guards who would, in turn, repeat her habits, counting steps, speaking softly to the air when alone, never whistling in the corridors. When asked why, she would only smile and say, "It's not empty in there." Sometimes she would walk past at night, even on her days off, listening from the street to the faint reverberation that never stopped. A low rhythm of chain and breath and chant. The Colosseum remembering itself again. In later years, tourists would bring cameras and microphones, and one recording made after midnight would capture a voice that none of the staff could explain. A man's low murmur in a language that had not been spoken for centuries, saying something like a command or a blessing. The sound file would circulate briefly before disappearing into archives, misfiled or misplaced like most truth, too impolite to be catalogued. But the guards who worked there would tell each other quietly the same sentence that had become part of the building's vocabulary. You are never alone in there. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, when fog hung over the arena and the chains began their patient circuit again, they would feel the faint tremor under their boots, as if a door were opening deep beneath the sand. If they looked down, they might see the wet spreading in a perfect circle, reflecting the ghost light of their lanterns. If they listened, they might hear breathing, measured, steady, waiting for the signal to begin again. And if they were unwise enough to call out, the air would answer with the old rhythm of the crowd. Thousands of unseen voices pressing forward in approval. Because in the Colosseum, nothing truly ends. The chants keep their measure. The chains keep time. The blood dries and returns. The gladiators never left. They keep fighting. They keep dying. They keep watching. May 20th, 1938. The hospital on the hill woke before Rome did, its windows pale with the first light, and its corridors smelling of carbolic, damp wool, and the thin metallic fear that always lived there. Santa Maria della Pietà was a city within the city. Wards like neighborhoods, stairwells like alleys, locked doors like borders agreed upon and never questioned. Most mornings, the wind carried birdsong from the pines and the clatter of a tram climbing Monte Mario. This morning, the wind carried promises made in offices and the rumor of a new method that would turn storms into weather. Physicians liked phrases that made cages sound like keys. A nurse named Ava walked the length of the third-floor corridor, counting step by step to keep her own breath in rhythm. She was 23 and wore her hair pinned under a cap that made her look older than she felt. She could thread a needle in failing light. She could lift a man twice her weight if she had a wall to brace against. She could hold a hand for the length of a fit without telling herself a story about what a soul looked like on the inside of their eyes. She could do almost anything except stop hearing footsteps that no one else made. The corridor had been swept an hour ago. Dust lay undisturbed, thin as failure, except where her own soul's printed a book no one intended to read. She paused at the landing. Behind her, nothing. Ahead, the door to the isolation ward. New locks with teeth that bit too eagerly. She had the key. She always had the key. She told herself that was why the footsteps followed her. Keys attract attention. She did not say the other reason aloud. This was the morning they would wheel the first patient toward a room whose ceiling had been scraped clean and whose walls held a promise borrowed from a laboratory across the city. Electroshock. Not thunder. Not mercy. A managed storm. The orderlies waited with the trolley, their faces wearing that careful blankness men borrow when they would like to be invisible to authority. The physician, Dr. R. Chershi, a man with a mustache that made him look convinced, stood with a clipboard and a voice so calm it almost smiled. Signora Lucia D., he said, as if reading a name could make it obedient. 31. Progressive melancholia. Refuses food. Hallucinative features. We will interrupt the loop. The last sentence had the righteousness of a liturgy. Eva nodded because her hands were already busy with straps and the small linen roll for the mouth, as if one could tutoring a body how not to break its own teeth while the lightning did its arithmetic. They wheeled Lucia slowly, past doors that remembered sobbing, past windows that stared like unwinking eyes. The patient's face was overwashed, too clean, too careful. The way people wash their grief when they are offered an appointment. Her hair lay in two braids the color of old polished wood. She did not speak. She looked at Eva once, as if recognizing a person who would bear witness without asking to be forgiven for it. The look was not a plea. It was a ledger entry. They reached the small theatre. Electric cables lay coiled like patient snakes. A device with dials sat on a table beside a ceramic bowl and a glass syringe. The physician adjusted his cuffs. His assistant recited settings. The orderlies did what they had been told to do to prepare for the arrival of science in a room that still smelled of wool and weather. Ava took the linen. She touched Lucia's wrist with a deliberate pressure that said, "Counted, counted, counted." "Begin," said the man who believed in beginnings. The current made no sound a person could write down. The body did what bodies do when asked an impossible question. Arched as if to look at the ceiling from inside the spine. Held every muscle like a sentence you cannot finish. Refused to breathe for a count that bent time. Ava kept the mouth roll in place with 2 fingers, strong and light, and did not look away. The physician watched the machine. The assistant watched the physician. The orderlies watched the floor. Lucia opened her eyes very wide. The pupils went from coins to wells. In one of them, Ava would always say this softly, not certain whom she admitted it to, was the image of the ceiling light, and something behind it. A shadow like the hinge of a door. When it was done, there was the machine's small sigh. There was the physician's larger one. There was a number written in a margin and underlined twice. There was a body that breathed again. There was a room that held a different temperature than it had held a minute earlier, as if something had left or entered through a window that was not there. The afternoon took on the cautious quiet that follows a demonstration. The administrators came and went, satisfied that progress had visited without leaving mud on boots. Ava wiped the room as if scrubbing would revise an entry in the hospital's memory. She returned Lucia to a bed at the end of the ward, near a window that refused to stay latched. The patient's eyelids fluttered like moths in a lamp. Then they were still. Her mouth opened on a word that never found its letters. Ava poured water and waited for the swallow that belongs to the living. It came late, like a guest the household had nearly given up on. In the corridor, the footsteps resumed. They had the pacing of someone counting the length between doors, someone learning the building by heart. Ava was not superstitious. That was a luxury. She was professional. That was a discipline. She listened anyway, and the body learned the rhythm against the will of the mind. 2 doors. Pause. 2 doors. Turn. The dust on the floor had no courtesy. No one had walked there in years, and yet a line of ovals appeared, faint and precise, crossing from the wall to the stairwell where the light fell thinner. On the top floor, the one nurses called the attic, though it had real rooms and windows like any other, floor. No patient slept. No one was assigned. The keys to its doors lived in a drawer that stuck. The story went that a decade earlier, the floor had been used for the overflow when winter made the wards hungry and the intake more than beds could mother. The second part of the story went that one night, a patient had climbed. The third part insisted that he never climbed down. It had been sealed. Not ceremonially, not even officially. Just locked, and then looked at as if emptiness could be made a fact by habit. Ava did not tell herself that footsteps came from there. She found the keys in the drawer anyway, and held them in her pocket like vocabulary against an untranslatable sentence. Evening came down like a curtain, and the lamps iced the corridor with a yellow. The physician left with his bag and his reputation uncreased. The orderlies smoked outside, their faces lit in little circles that looked like the eyes of animals who do not blink. The patient slept or pretended to. The hospital made its night noises, pipes knocking politely, a cartwheel complaining, the cough that sounds more like someone else's dream than a symptom. Ava made her rounds with tea and a voice she had learned from her mother, a woman who had washed floors for a convent and could quiet the unquiet with a psalm she never sang aloud. At 10:30, the footsteps moved again, quicker this time, and stopped outside the door of the room where Lucia lay. Ava turned the handle as if it had been waiting to be touched. The patient stared at the ceiling without seeing it. Her mouth was slightly open. Her hands were relaxed in the formal pose of those who have reached the end of argument. Ava touched the wrist, counted, present. She stood a moment longer because standing changes the air. Then the sound resumed, angling itself down the corridor toward the stairs that led to the sealed floor. She followed before she decided to. Perhaps it is more accurate to say that the body decided and the mind did its best to catch up and narrate. She went lightly, not to disturb dust that had maintained an argument for years about the necessity of feet. At the door to the stair, the air shifted in temperature the way a house changes when someone leaves a window open in a far room. The keyhole had the oval of a mouth refusing to speak. Ava took out the ring from her pocket and turned the metal with a gentleness that made a compliment of force. The key resisted and then agreed. The top floor smelled less like disinfectant and more like a schoolroom. Chalk dust, old paper, the memory of breath. Moonlight went a short distance and then huddled on the floor like a cold animal. Chairs stood in clusters, thin-legged, polite. A gurney leaned against a wall as if pretending it belonged to furniture that did not move. The dust laid its thin law over everything. On the far end, in the doorway of a room that had once been offices, sat a chair with a person in it. Ava stopped where the floorboards told her to stop. She felt each rib under her blouse the way women do when the body reminds them it is bearing more than it was promised. The figure in the chair held the posture of someone who had arrived early to a meeting and had not yet decided whether to be bored or offended. Head tilted, hands resting on the thighs, like coasters laid out for guests. There was such stillness that it had an attitude. She spoke the practical sentence that reminds the living they are still the living. Signore? The figure did not answer. She felt an absurd urge to fix the collar that lay askew on the shape's throat. She stepped closer, the dust pretending she had not. The face was turned toward the window, away from the door, holding a wedge of moonlight on its cheek. The skin was too smooth, the pallor too plain. It was the color of paper that has spent years under other papers. The mouth was closed, the lips forming the determined line of someone refusing to taste what the world offers. The eyes. She avoided the eyes. Profession is a lace that holds together the parts of a person that would prefer to fall. She reached out because there is an instinct in nurses that has outlived language. Make the shape of care with your hand, and the world may behave. Her fingers hovered a breath from the shoulder. The figure moved, not a twitch, not a trick of shadow, but the small correction a person makes when someone says their name in a crowded room. The head turned a fraction. The mouth softened, and then widened, and then opened, slowly, with the deliberation of a drawer that holds delicate things. No sound came. The room held its breath as if not to drown out whatever was being withheld. The mouth opened farther. Not the surprise of a scream, not the architecture of a yawn. It had the shape of a word that was deciding whether air deserved it. The throat showed a faint ladder of sinew, and nothing else. If sound existed, it was living elsewhere. Ava wanted to place a hand lightly under the jaw and say, as to a patient learning to swallow after illness, "There you go." She did not move. What came instead was smaller than sound. A draft, warm, carrying the smell of metal and salt, and something electrical cut off mid-syllable. It touched Eva's face and then was gone. The mouth closed as if the body had changed its mind. The head tilted back to its former angle. The figure gave her the courtesy of being still again, as if wanting to spare her the labor of recognizing motion where she had been pretending to catalogue furniture. She stood a long minute. She could hear, far below, a cart being rolled too fast and striking a door frame. A complaint like a spoon against a pot. The hospital had places that did not glow with myth. It had sheets to change, medicines to count, human messes that proved life insists. Ava took a breath and turned. She returned her keys to her pocket and left the room, as if leaving were part of the bargain. On the landing, she paused and looked back, without stepping back. The figure did not change. Dust held its line like handwriting. The next morning, the top floor was sealed. Not a ceremony, not a decree with signatures that knew how to spell their own importance. The administrator gave 2 orderlies the practical order. Lock that level, barring the stair at the bottom with a door older than both of them. "It's not in use," he said, and tapped a list that behaved like policy. The physician scowled very gently at superstition. The locksmith from the city worked his violence with a professional tenderness and left behind a smell of oil that lived under the new condition like a footnote. To the ledger, the act meant efficiency. To the staff, it meant the place where footsteps come from was told to stop. Life went on doing the loud work of being ordinary. The hospital absorbed more bodies, more diagnoses, more ideas about what might be done to minds that fold in upon themselves. Ava continued to walk the corridors with tea and the competence of people whose care outweighs their fatigue. Lucia spoke once, a single sentence, to no one, slowly, as if teaching herself to be heard. "It is quieter inside my head." The physician underlined improved effect and wrote in the margin a plan for another treatment. Eva brought a comb and parted the patient's hair with the care one brings to a pilgrimage. At night, the footsteps changed. They no longer began behind Eva on her rounds. They no longer paused by the door where Lucia slept. They printed themselves faintly on dust where no one walked. Up the last stair, along the sealed door, back again. An unfinished loop like a child learning to write a circle and failing the join. The orderlies swept and found their brooms speaking to footprints that returned before dawn. One swore he heard a chair gently scrape across old floorboards above his head. Another said he smelled singed wool and rain. Ward gossip grew like ivy, avoiding direct sun. A laundry woman said she had seen a shadow pass a window that should have shown only sky. A porter claimed a chair had been moved 2 inches from a mark it had left in dust years before. The locksmith's apprentice returned, more from curiosity than commission, and pressed his ear against the sealed seam and smiled with the reckless intelligence of boys. "It's only air," he said, and grew pink when the air breathed on him, warm as a mouth and gone as a decision. In 1940, the war reached even places that had always believed themselves separate from weather. Rations thinned. Windows were blacked. Nurses learned to do more with less, and to hide not only their bodies in doorways, but their grief in new pockets. The hospital accepted evacuees and refused to admit they were war's patients by using a different ink. Once, at midday, the top floor made a sound that the building had never made before. wood flexing as if bearing a weight with patience, followed by a precise tap, tap, tap that could have been a hand seeking the rhythm of a door. No one went up. The door remained barred. The barred door behaved like a psalm, recited so often it became the only way to speak. The figure in the chair sat in memory, and in dust, and in rumor. Someone said it was a man. Someone said it was a woman. Someone said it was the idea of a patient that all institutions invent in order not to grieve any particular one. Eva did not say much. She carried the keys in her pocket the way a priest carries a relic, not to show but to be reminded. She worked nights more often, as years wore their grooves. She learned the quietest parts of the building's voice. She learned to tell a cough from a dream by the way the sound touched the doorframe as it passed. Once, late in 1943, when the city's breath came in spurts, and the hospital counted not only pulses, but bombs by distance and habit, a girl from the kitchen staff ran to Eva with a tale that held itself like a bundle of sticks. "On the stair," she said, and clutched at air at her waist as if balancing a bowl. "I dropped the flower. I was scolded. I swept. There were prints." Eva followed her, because following is part of a nurse's job. On the steps, White had made an honest bluff of snow. Across it, a line of ovals, neat and narrow, went up and not down, as if the walker had no habit of returning. In front of the sealed door, the flower held the shape of a chair leg repositioned, and the half moon of a shoe that sat for a while, and then resumed being absent. "Do you hear anything?" the girl whispered. There was nothing soused in drama in her voice. It was the question a child asks when the dark is polite but firm. Eva listened. She heard a breath that did not belong to her and did not belong to the girl. Not in the ear, in the air, measured, waiting. She nodded. The girl made a little sound in her throat that belonged to centuries of women who have known their fear is a precise instrument and not an exaggeration. "Go," Eva said gently, and touched the girl's shoulder. "They are seated." It was an absurd sentence. It felt correct. By 1948, the hospital had begun to speak of new treatments as if they were seasons that would replace others without calling it a change. The language softened. Walls were painted. Windows were entreated to behave like openings instead of eyes. Someone polished the brass on a stair rail and decided it improved the minds of those who touched it. The top floor stayed sealed because to unseal it would have demanded a history, and history was a complicated subject. Eva retired in the spring of 1949 because bodies have accounts, and hers had paid faithfully. She visited once a month with a parcel of biscuits that tasted of lemon and the kitchen elder's gratitude. She sat in the shade of the courtyard and watched pigeons behave with the pertinacity of old favours. She did not ask after the sealed floor. She did not need to. She could feel the hospital continuing with it in the way a person with an old fracture knows rain an hour before the sky confesses. On the day she chose to say her last goodnight to the building, though she did not tell anyone that was what she was doing, she took the long route that led past the stair. She paused. The light from the high windows fell in a lattice on the steps. Dust carried its same argument. The door stood with its bar shouldering it like a friend who means well and never lets go. She reached into her coat and touched the outline of the keys she no longer carried. Her hand closed on air. She smiled at herself, at the particular vanity of human hands wanting to be useful even when usefulness has been retired. She stood a while longer because some partings require standing. In the seam where the wood met the wall, something warmer than draft moved. A breath measured, tidy, present. She could smell. Not disinfectant, not wool, not carbolic, but rain and iron, and the faintest whisper of the electrical storm that had been promised years ago to turn chaos into weather. I know, she said, as a person says to a room that has been listening for decades. It was not a prayer. It was not a concession. It was a line in the ledger balanced at last. Downstairs the kettle clicked. A patient laughed, once, then twice, as if someone had told him a joke that disagreed less with his head than the others did. A physician set down a pen. A tray rattled. The city exhaled its chronic awe. Ava went down the stairs with the slowness of someone who wants each step to remember her weight. The top floor remained sealed. It would stay sealed long enough for dust to learn names and chairs to memorize the specific, not quite stillness that human backs impart. Those who snuck in, there are always those, because buildings teach daring, would report the same things in different metaphors. Footsteps behind them when no one had walked. Prints that crossed their own and criticized them. A figure sitting with head tilted as if counting the heartbeats of those who could still borrow them. They would say that when they approached, the figure's mouth opened slowly, as if finally deciding to spend a word, and no sound came. What they did not always tell was the smallest part. The warm draft on the face, carrying iron and rain, and a patience that had outlived slogans. They did not say the chair sometimes scraped as if adjusting to a new kind of listening. They did not say that in the exact moment the mouth opened, something adjusted in them, the way a picture straightens on a wall without hands to do it. The hospital learned new names for compassion and for harm. It learned the powder of plaster and the vocabulary of demolition and the ways cities erase their own handwriting and call it legibility. In the ledgers, dates entered and left with dignity. In the walls, breath continued to thread itself into sentences you could not hear with the ear, but could consent to feel. On certain nights, when wind comes down from Monte Mario, and the lights of Rome tremble like water held up to the moon, a nurse walking a corridor, any year, pauses and turns, certain she's been counted. No one is there. The dust holds its peace. The sealed door waits where it has always waited, a polite denial. And behind it, in the chair that remembers each person who ever borrowed it, for an hour of being seen, a figure tilts its head, opens its mouth, and confers a silence so exact, it becomes a kind of answer.